things that have gone wrong.
Lees-Galloway.
Mr. Chairman, we've had a bit of conversation about the title, and my last contribution was on the title. I'd like to move now to Clause 2, the commencement, because actually the commencement of this Act, or this bill when it becomes an Act, is probably one of the areas of the most contention. This is all to do with the timing of the referendums. My colleague, the Honourable Trevor Mallard, has offered an amendment by supplementary order paper that would amend Clause 2, subsection 1, so that it reads, "This Act, except subsections 69, 70 and 71, comes into force 5 years after the date on which it receives the royal assent." And I guess this is 5 years is somewhat arbitrary, because you can't put things in a commencement clause like when the government can run a surplus, or when we don't have $101 billion worth of debt, or when we can get the cost of running these referendums down. So I guess what Mr. Mallard is attempting to do here is sort of project into the future and make a couple of assumptions. One, I think an important one, is that we have a Labor government, because that leads to two, which is that we'll actually have some decent economic management, and we'll have a fair chance of the government heading back towards being in black again, and actually being in a position where people might see holding a referendum or two referendums on changing the flag as something which is more relevant and a more appropriate use of the money that's needed to run those referendums. Because look, these things do cost money. Democracy costs money. I appreciate that the government has proposed a democratic approach to this. We have some questions over the order of the referendums, but at least it is being done by referendum, not by fiat, and that costs money. But we really do question, should this Act be commencing? Should it come into force on the day after it receives the royal assent, which is what Clause 2, subsection 1 provides for? Or should it be put off to a date in the future where the government's books might be in a better state, and it is in a state where this could be more of a priority? And this is what a lot of the opposition to the government's process comes down to. When exactly the legislation should come into force. I don't actually think most members of the public would be too concerned about the fact that we're debating this legislation now. They might have a view that there are other more pressing issues to be debating in public, but the debate now is not as big a problem as holding the referendums this year and next year. So I support Trevor Mallard's amendment to Clause 2, subsection 1, because I think that, arbitrary as it is, 5 years from now is probably a more appropriate point in time for us to have those referendums and the expenditure that comes with them. So there are some other aspects to the commencement clause that are certainly appropriate for this legislation, but are somewhat unusual. There are various sections of the legislation may or may not commence, and of course this relates to what the result may be of the second referendum. Obviously the first referendum has no bearing on the commencement of any of the clauses in this legislation, because whatever happens, there will be two referendums with all the cost that comes with that. But the second referendum does have a bearing on whether or not certain sections of this legislation do actually commence. And those are sections 69, 70 and 71. And of course, those sections would not need to commence in the event that the public voted to retain the current flag. Another interesting matter with the commencement of sections 69, 70 and 71 is that there's two triggers for the commencement of those sections, which is a little bit unusual in legislation as well. So the first trigger is, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman.
I call Joanne Hayes.
I move that the question